There's a saying that goes something like this: every once in a while, modern people find traditionalism and think they've really found something special. Well, in my experience, that has been the case with retro rifles. Old GATs like this M16 or like CAR-15s, M16A2s, they've just come in vogue recently, and I think that that is pretty cool. So a while back, I started a series, and I'd like to continue that with you today, and it was asking basically a question something like this: how far can we push old rifles like this one into the modern world? And we are doing this by focusing on 4 main things. Every modern rifle should have a modern sling, a modern optic, and a modern light. Now, I both have videos on how I put together this M16A1 and about this sling and how I have it attached the way that I do, as well as some other options. This video is going to be focusing on the optic, but before we can do that, we need to talk about some of our 4 priorities. Now, when we talked about this last time, we set up a sandbox. And what that means is we set up 4 walls or 4 parameters that we are going to stay inside of, and as long as we play inside of there, we will be accomplishing the goals that I'm trying to accomplish. The first thing we talked about is making a multi-purpose rifle. What this means as multi-purpose is that we don't want to take away any features of an AR-15 that take it away from the modern rifle category. These rifles are meant to be multi-purpose, and we'd like to keep that. The second thing is pretty similar. We want to increase the functionality. We don't want to add something just because it looks cool or just because it's modern if it doesn't actually make the rifle more effective. The third is we want to be retro faithful. Whatever we put on this rifle, we want it to look retro. We don't necessarily want to do something like going and replacing the handguards or putting a flat top upper on this one in particular. And finally, I'd like to do this by making no permanent modifications to the gun. This gun is an original M16A1 parts kit that could have even been used in the Vietnam War maybe, and so I don't want to make a change to it that takes away that historical factor. While I might attach things to it, I don't want to do anything that can't be undone easily. So with those things in mind, let's talk about some methods for attaching things to old guns like this. And the first one that I feel like we just need to talk about, even though it's not possible on this gun necessarily, is in some cases you might just decide to get a flat top upper. Depending on the type of clone build you're doing, or if you're doing a gun but you don't want to spend as much money or as much time finding a fixed carry handle upper, you can find a flat top upper and then attach something like this removable carry handle. It just has Picatinny slots and it can attach right there. However, depending on the gun and depending on how retro you're going, you might not need a carry handle at all. So maybe you'll do something like one of those CAC rear sights and then put something like this full-sized red dot on it, and that will achieve the look you're going for without going through the trouble of finding a fixed carry handle upper and then finding a way to attach optics to that. The advantage of this is that it is the most modern option, and so you have the most options with what you're going to do as a part of that. And another advantage is that it's the easiest to find. You can find these removable carry handles on eBay for $60 to $70, and you can attach them to really any flat top upper that you happen to find. However, the main disadvantage is that it's not that retro. That was really beginning to see adoption in the early 90s, and as far as military adoption goes, it was quite a while after that before it was really in full swing. So maybe that's the build that you want to do, and honestly, generally speaking, detachable carry handles work. They do the same things, it's just not quite as old. Now for the carry handle people, we're going to talk about how to attach an optic to something like this, or the M16A1 or M16A2s that have the fixed carry handle have this as well. This is just a little easier to hold for the camera at times, so you maybe see me using it. Now, these types of sights have a hole right here that you can see, and what that hole is for attaching optics. Now, if we go really broad, there are basically 3 different attachments that you can do. The first is something that connects directly to this. You might be familiar with those old Vietnam War 4x20 scopes, and it was basically a scope that just screwed right into that hole, and you were in business. You didn't need an adapter, you didn't need anything else. All you used was the sight directly into the hole. If you're looking at a direct setup, one option that you have is those old Vietnam War 4x21 scopes that you may have seen. Now, Brownells sells one made in Japan, made in actually the same factory that they used to be made in, and you can get them for around $300. So basically you have the exact same thing as what people had in Vietnam, but you're getting it made today with modern manufacturing and modern quality of production. Another really interesting option that connects this way is the Armson OEG. Now, it looks kind of like a red dot, but instead of being a traditional red dot, you are meant to keep both eyes open and the side that you're actually looking through is black with just a dot in the middle. But when you have both eyes open, you just see that dot transposed on your target. It's a really cool old option. I don't know what term you would use, but one of the older options available for a both eyes open reflex style sight. They are pretty cool. There are some other options too, like I've seen ACOGs that also have this attachment point. However, some of the other options can be quite a bit more expensive. I'm sure if you look around, you might be able to find some. And also, talking about that Brownell setup, I know you can find things on Amazon or eBay too that are not made by Brownells and not made in the same factory. I wouldn't speak for the quality of those, but it is an option depending on what you're going for. If you're going for like an airsoft gun setup, maybe that's something for you. So some of the pros are that this was the earliest option available before they had the Picatinny mounts or anything like that. And so because of that, it really does give a classic look, and some of those really were used in the earliest rifles. Another advantage is that there's no adapter needed to use this style of setup. However, there are some cons too, and I think the biggest one is just that it limits your options quite a bit. As far as I've seen, there's really only 3 or 4 or 5 types of sights that connect this way. Maybe there are some others, but there's not very many. At least not as many as with our other options. Now, the second option for mounting something to a carry handle is using something like this, which is just a Picatinny adapter. And the way that you install these is it just goes right in like that, and then you have a screw that's supposed to go on the end. So once you get that threaded in, you just like that. And then you'd want to tighten that down really tight, maybe even put some Loctite on it. And then you can mount your optic directly to the top of this. There are a few different options of this available. This one is just a really cheap option I got from Amazon, and so I think it cost me about $10. Usually they're somewhere between $7 to $20, but with this thing you are sacrificing quality and durability to an extent. To what extent, I don't know if I really feel comfortable telling you. I haven't used this too much yet. I know there's also one made by Leopold or Leupold or Leopold. I don't know, whoever you say that, but there's one made by them that's around $40 to $50. I would trust the quality of that one quite a bit more, but I also don't know if it mounts higher. One of the things I do like about this one is that it is a really low mount. I would say that the biggest advantage of this system is that you can mount just about anything to it. You can mount red dots, scopes, really whatever you have, you can most likely mount it to Picatinny, so because of that you do have a ton of options available to you. Another big advantage that you should be able to do with most of these is that you can still use your iron sights. Now, at least with this one that I got from Amazon, when you use the 0 to 200 sight on the detachable carry handles of the M16A2s, you can see the bottom of the mount in the peep sight. So that is something to keep in mind. You can still use it though, but with the M16A1 as well as the longer range sights, you don't have that problem since it's a smaller circle. The biggest con that I would give this one is the potential for height over bore issues. So when you have this, you can see that it's mounted from the top of the sight, and it is mounted above where you would normally have your face. So depending on what kind of sight you mount on this, you could end up with something that is quite a bit higher than the gun, and it makes it difficult to get a cheek weld. You kind of end up with more of like a AK style chin weld. Now, that's not necessarily true with all sights. You could get some lower profile sights, but it is something I wanted to let you know so that you could be aware of it before you go for something like this. I specifically tested this with the Sig Sauer Romeo 7, and since its battery option is down here on the bottom instead of up here on the top like an Aimpoint Comp M4, it means that it can't go quite as low, so it is a higher profile option. With this, it was quite hard to get a regular cheek weld. But that does bring us to our final option, which is what I went with on this rifle, and that is a gooseneck. A gooseneck is these really weird looking mounts that mount to the top of the carry handle and then fold down and then go over the first part of the handguard. I think they're pretty cool looking, and they're kind of strange. The best place to get these is used on a place like eBay. They're usually somewhere between $30 and $40, and they're almost all military surplus from what I can tell. I believe Aimpoint made them for one of their reflex sights or for the M5 or something. However, they do just have one Picatinny slot where the little screw is supposed to go. Some of the pros are that these look really cool. They're kind of bizarre and they get the optic really far forward, but they are pretty neat. Another advantage is that you have the height over bore issue solved since it is just a little bit above the regular iron sights. Also, an advantage of this setup is that you really sort of have a co-witness possible with this type of thing. So when I look through here, I can see my iron sights. Now, like I said, this optic is a little bit higher than some other optics on the market. And so when I do get down low, I can just barely see the point of the front sight through this when I have the front sight in the center of the rear sight. However, I do think that if you had a lower profile optic for this, you could hypothetically get close to a 1/3 co-witness. Now let's talk the cons. One of the biggest ones, in my opinion, is that one, it is kind of heavy and it puts a lot of the weight forward. So when you have something like an M16A1 or an M16A2 that has that longer barrel, especially the M16A2, which has a thicker government barrel instead of this pencil, I'm sure a little bit more weight forward is not really what you're looking for. It is still pretty handy because it's not before my support hand, it is still behind my support hand. However, it is pretty far forward, and that's just extra weight on the front end of the gun. A second issue is that it's not compatible with all options of sights. One example of one that I tried that didn't work, I bought this really cheap sight from a gun store I was at. It's just one of those really cheap ones you can get from Amazon or eBay, the made in China ones. And because of where the rail is, which would be turned around this way so you can see, the rail would be somewhere right here. And so when you have this right here, you run into that part of the mount. You also obviously can't use scopes or things like that with this. You're really limited to red dots in particular, and particularly red dots that don't have anything too far back of where the screw is. You can see this one, the screw is all the way in the front. I can't tell you what all this would or would not work with, but basically if you have something like this where the screw goes through the middle, you should be safe. Another issue is that there is a potential for things to get caught in this little slot right here. So I haven't had this happen personally yet, but I could see it being an issue. Slings can get caught in there, clothing could get caught in there, and when you try to pull up your gun or use your gun, you could have just things that are stopping that from working. Stuff like that where there is one way into an area, I'm personally not a huge fan of for that reason. Obviously, I have it on this rifle, and I'm going to have it on this rifle for a little while longer, but just something I wanted you guys to be aware of. Finally, I already mentioned the weight thing, but this really is just a lot of metal. So whereas the other sight would just be metal from about here to about here, this one has metal that whole way, and then metal going forward as well. It's heavy. One other quick thing I'd like to talk about, just because it is a product that's out there, is recently I've seen some RMR mounts. So basically it's like this one, except it is thinner, only about that thick, and it's meant to attach something like a Trijicon RMR so that you can have just a really tiny red dot on top of your carry handle. I wouldn't really call it retro, but it is pretty cool, so it's something that's out there. Now finally, when we talk about options for what you could do for your sights, basically the world is your oyster. Now personally, I'm going to keep the third point pretty relevant, which is I want to stick with something that has a retro aesthetic. I don't want to put something like one of those RMR mounts. I'd rather do something that's like a full covered red dot or something that has that older look. Two things I already mentioned were those Brownells 4x21s and the Armson OEG. However, some other options might include aim points. These are quite expensive and pricey options. I'm going to talk about some more budget-friendly ones in a second. But aim point, the M4 and the M4S, M5s, the Pros, those are all actually older optics that were in use in the early 2000s as well as the late 90s and are still in use today. They are high quality optics, so I'm not saying that they are too expensive for what they provide. However, personally, I'm just not in a place where I really should be spending $400 on an optic. If you are, that is a pretty cool option that you have. One other option that I think is pretty cool that I'd like to actually get and test is a Seymour Railway. You can find them anywhere from around $200 to $300 depending on which particular type you're going for. And they are an open red dot, kind of like this one. Let me open this up so I can show you, but it doesn't look anything like this. It's an open red dot, kind of like this one, but not really, where it has just the one circle and you look through it like that versus a closed red dot like the one I have on my rifle. They're also a really old red dot company, and the red dots they make are quality and look really cool. I think if I was going to go with something like this in the future, I would go with one of those Seymours because the Railway is pretty low profile versus something like my Romeo 7. Also, you are actually getting a retro brand versus a clone of one of the more expensive brands. Since we're talking about clones, let's move on. When we talk about clones, there are basically two different types. There is cheap clones made by Chinese companies that really aren't quality. Those will be usually under $50, sometimes a little bit more than that though, depending on what you're getting. However, the other kind is stuff from reputable brands, or at least well-known brands. It might still be made in China, but it does have a little bit more quality behind it. And talking about something like that would be the SIG Romeo 7. I also know that Primary Arms and HoloSun have some options that are clones of those old aim points. However, they are much more budget conscious. They will have logos from those companies, but that's to be expected. Particularly, like I might have said, this SIG Romeo 7 is the same profile as an Aimpoint M4S. The M4 has the battery right up here, however the M4S has the battery on the bottom, like this one does. This one takes AAAs, and it has the shake awake feature that if you have a Romeo 5, it also has. So I can just leave it always on in the place that I want it in my safe, and then when I pick it up, it is ready to use. I've only put a few hundred rounds through this one, and so I don't know if that's necessarily enough to go and say you should go out and buy one. However, if you are interested in it, I've had good experiences so far. It isn't necessarily an exact clone of the M4S, however, it is pretty similar. So personally, I would say one of the greatest pros of this in this context is that it is from a reputable brand, and it looks retro, but on a much more friendly budget. Some of the cons are that it is bigger and heavier, and that's exacerbated by the issue of the gooseneck, which is putting weight a little bit more forward. Also, that iron sight compatibility issue that I mentioned, you might have issues with some iron sights in an optic like this, and it does have pretty sizable logos. So again, if that's the kind of thing that should bother you, you might need to go for a name brand. But I also know some of those really, really cheap Chinese copies are marked like the name brands. Now, I think that that is breaking copyright law, but it is the reality of the situation. So for your retro rifle, you have quite a few optics setups. You could do, if we go really briefly over them, a detachable carry handle. You could do one of these types of rails to go on top of either your detachable carry handle or your carry handle that is fixed to your gun. And your other option for a fixed carry handle or detachable carry handle is a gooseneck mount like this one. As far as actual optics that you might want to attach, you have many options, and that's something you have to decide, not me. If you think I missed anything in this video, please leave a comment down below. I love to read them. However, I put a SIG Romeo 7 on a gooseneck mount on my M16A1, and I lived on.
Which proves it's hard to get the best of a man named John.